Okay, welcome back, students who are in the junior seminar. This is our next on the process to synthesis lecture. This lecture is concept. Hopefully, if all goes well, this will be a two-part lecture. Maybe if I get too wordy, it might go to three. And so the last lecture was about process, and this lecture is about concept. And I guess the first thing I want to talk about a little bit is why process first and then concept. Most students would think that concept should come first, that it just seems logical. Well, you have your idea first and then you figure out how to do it. And one of the main points of the class is that you should often think about flipping that and then flipping it again, like that you should start with process. You should start by just trying to think about how much you can open up your process, because that allows you to then generate a lot of work. And then by focusing on process and focusing on generating a lot of work, that is a really good place to start when it comes to beginning to think about your concept. Instead of starting with just, well, I'm going to come up with the most brilliant idea ever, you make a lot of stuff first, and then you look at that stuff, and then you begin to figure out what are interesting ideas that you are starting to think about. So that concept should come through process and continue through process. And so generally for almost like in any kind of advanced studio class, the very beginning part should be very, very focused on process. Then the second part should be focused on concept. And then the next part should return to process and think about how, now that we have a more clear idea of what our concept is, how can we more think about honing in on what kind of process we want to do to enact that. And only at the end of the semester should you really get really focused on product. And then in a similar way, I think for most studio course or most studio students who are working towards senior show, your course of study starting from about your second semester junior year also should kind of follow that same process. Those early semesters should be very focused on process, and then the next semester more focused on concept, and then really the final semester or the final two semesters really should get focused on product. Okay, anyway, let's talk about concept. And to understand this lecture about concept, the first thing we need to understand is conceptual art, because a lot of the art we're going to be looking at is art that is considered conceptual art, but a lot of people have misunderstandings as to what is conceptual art. I think a lot of people think that conceptual art is art that is about an idea, that there is some big idea to this work of art and that the art is communicating that. That is one definition, not a particularly good definition of conceptual art, but to me, but it is one that some people use. And a lot of people feel like the way that a student should learn to be more conceptual is to learn to pick some key ideas and then try to figure out how to communicate those ideas. That's not how I think about conceptual art. I think the whole history of conceptual art is really about the idea that artists were trying to make the audience, make viewers of art understand that art is fundamentally an idea, that any work of art that you see is fundamentally an idea. So, and then emphasizing the idea-ness of the work of art. And that's part of that whole movement that we talked about in the last lecture of artists trying to remove the objectness from art. And that removing the objectness from art is a way of removing the commodity from art. The fact that art still sells and sells for even more probably makes that somewhat somewhat of a moot point. But anyway, let's start looking at some artists. So Sol LeWitt. We talked about and looked at some work by Sol LeWitt before, but I don't necessarily want to talk about all of his work, but I do want to talk about, I do like this piece, this wall drawing piece. I talk about this in my art appreciation class a lot. I want to talk about like one aspect of his work. One of the things he would do is he would develop these kind of wall installation line drawings, and he would develop them in his studio. He would make them, measure them out, organize them, plot out exactly where all the points were and how the drawing was made, and he would create a list of instructions as to how this drawing was made. He would do this all in his studio directly on the walls, and when he was done, he would whitewash all the studio walls and the drawings would be gone. But what would be left would be the instructions for the drawing. And then he would mail the instructions to the gallery where the show was going to happen. And the instructions were like kind of like a code, like a programmer writing computer code. The instructions were the work of art, right? And then the workers at that gallery would use the instructions and recreate the drawing that he had made in his studio. So that when he went to his opening for his exhibition, he would not have had his hand on any part of his work of art. But he designed the work, he designed the set of instructions. And in some ways, this is very much about conceptual art, because this is the idea of saying, like, look, the artwork is just the idea, just the series of ideas, and nothing else. And then also in these gallery installations, when the show is over, the walls are repainted and the work disappears. Actually, before we get to John Baldessari, I do want to very quickly talk about Joseph Kossuth, who's right here, because in some ways his work, the chair piece, is kind of the most famous work of conceptual art and kind of really sums up the idea. But I think a lot of people misunderstand the work. They look at that and they think that it's about the concept of the chair, and that it's a definition of a chair. There's a physical chair, and then there's the picture of the chair. But really, it's about the concept of what is a work of art, and that, do you need the actual chair there, or do you just need the definition, or do you need anything there? Can you just describe to someone, I went to see an exhibition and there was a picture of a chair, and then the actual same chair and a definition of the word chair? Is that enough to describe the experience of the art? So in that way, I think Kossuth's work fits into Sol LeWitt and John Baldessari, who we're going to be talking about right about now. So there's a lot to John Baldessari's work, and his later work are very interesting in a lot of different ways. And in some ways, some of his best work is stuff that kind of went beyond conceptual art and started to become more interested in imagery again. But for the purposes of this course, the most important work that he made was about 2 years after graduating from school as a painter. And he'd been working as a painter in Los Angeles and not having much success, and himself realizing that he was actually a terrible painter. He decided that he was going to make a complete and dramatic break, and that he was going to do completely different kind of work. And so he gathered up all his paintings, he hired a crematorium, and he burned all of his paintings to ashes, and put them in a funerary urn. He did it with a group of friends because he said something like, when you decide to give up drinking or give up smoking, you don't keep it a secret from anyone. You tell everybody so they can hold you to it. So I was giving up painting, and I wanted to make it as public as possible. So we had this public ceremony where he buried his paintings. He burned them to ashes and buried them. And then the very next work that he made was a sheet of paper which he filled, writing the phrase, "I will not make any more boring art," over and over again. And that was kind of like the start of his new body of work and his new kind of point of view of what he was going to be doing. He then turned that into a wall installation in a gallery later on. Okay, Chris Burden. So we're kind of getting focused here on the LA scene. So Chris Burden, about the same time as John Baldessari, and excuse that noise, my dog just chased some cats and knocked some bowls over. Probably the most famous thing about Chris Burden is when he had a friend nail him to his Volkswagen Beetle. But he also, maybe even more famously, he hired someone to shoot him in a gallery installation, and he was supposed to get shot in the arm, and they had tests. The guy was an expert marksman, had actually been at Vietnam and knew exactly what he was doing, but still, when he got shot in the arm, that's my 9-minute warning. All right, we're going to end there. Let's just say Chris Burden did live. Don't worry, but I'll tell you more about what happened next